He was a billionaire hidden behind glass walls and perfect suits, cold, untouchable, and haunted by a love he could never forget. She was an intern on her first day, nervous, lost, and one wrong door away from changing everything. When Hailey walked in on Richard Vale crying alone in his office, she offered no judgment, just a tissue and the words, "It's okay to cry." She didn't know he was the CEO. He didn't know she'd become the one person who could make him feel alive again. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The rain came down in sheets, turning the city streets into rivers that reflected the steely gray of the sky. Hailey Martin clutched her umbrella tightly, her fingers stiff from both the cold and nerves. Her black flats squelched as she crossed the slick marble lobby of Vale Corp Tower, the sound echoing faintly as she walked toward the security desk. She was 23, barely out of university, and this was her first real job, the beginning of a future she'd worked tooth and nail to achieve. Her hair, hastily pulled into a bun, had begun to unravel from the downpour, and she self-consciously smoothed it back while presenting her ID. The security guard smiled warmly. "Welcome to Vale Corp, Miss Martin. HR is on the 15th floor. Straight to the elevators." "Thank you," she said, returning the smile, her voice barely above a whisper. The elevator ride was quiet and agonizingly slow. She adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced at her reflection in the brushed steel doors. Not exactly put together, but passable. She rehearsed her introduction in her head, silently mouthing the words. When the elevator dinged, Hailey stepped out, eyes scanning for signage. The hallway was bright, polished, and unnervingly quiet. She walked left, following the frosted glass panels with names and titles etched in silver. Human Resources was nowhere in sight. Growing more uncertain, she stopped in front of an unmarked door. The polished gold handle gleamed, and despite her gut hesitation, she knocked lightly, no response. Maybe it was a conference room? A break room? She twisted the handle gently and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dim, the only light coming from the floor-to-ceiling windows. A tall figure stood with his back to her, shoulders hunched, one hand pressed to the glass. The view overlooked the skyline, but he wasn't looking at it. His head was bowed, his posture rigid, yet trembling. The sound that followed made Hailey's breath catch, barely audible, but unmistakable. A soft, broken sob. She should have stepped out immediately. She should have apologized and left. But something about the way his shoulders shook, the way his hand gripped the edge of the desk like it was the only thing anchoring him, stopped her cold. He turned slightly, just enough for her to glimpse his profile. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, the kind of tailored suit worn by people far above her pay grade. But none of that mattered. His eyes were red-rimmed, glassy with unshed tears. His pain was raw, open, and disarmingly human. She didn't know what moved her, but she stepped inside. "I'm sorry," she said softly, voice barely carrying. "I thought this was the HR office." "But," she hesitated, reaching into her bag and pulling out a travel-sized pack of tissues. Slowly, she crossed the room, holding it out like a peace offering. "You don't have to say anything," she added, her voice steady now. "But it's okay to cry. Whoever told you otherwise was wrong." He looked at her then, stunned, eyes wide with confusion. No mask of authority, no commanding tone. Just silence and the weight of everything he carried. "I'll go," she said, offering a gentle smile. "I hope today gets better." She set the tissues on the corner of the desk, gave him one last look, and turned to leave. She never saw him straighten up, or the way his eyes followed her like he'd just glimpsed something he didn't know he needed. The door clicked shut behind her, and she exhaled sharply, heart pounding. She didn't know who he was. She didn't even know his name. But something told her that she had just walked into a moment she wasn't meant to see, and somehow it mattered. Hailey's heart still hadn't settled by the time she found the actual Human Resources office. 2 doors down, with a clearly labeled plaque that she somehow missed in her panic. Her cheeks were flushed as she apologized profusely to the receptionist, who waved her in with a distracted smile, barely noticing her disheveled appearance. After signing a few onboarding forms and receiving a generic welcome packet, she was shown to the 18th floor, where the interns were stationed. The room buzzed with soft chatter, the clack of keyboards, and the occasional ding of email notifications. A handful of other interns were already seated at cubicles, some typing away, others trying too hard to look busy. Hailey found her assigned seat, small but neat, a company-branded notepad placed carefully in the center. She sat down, trying to steady her breathing. "Rough morning," a voice chirped beside her. Hailey turned to see a girl with auburn curls and sharp eyes peeking over the divider. She grinned. "I'm Nia, marketing intern. You look like you just escaped a horror movie." Hailey gave a weak laugh. "I walked into the wrong office. Opened the door on someone having a very, personal moment." Nia leaned forward, eyes glinting with curiosity. "Who?" "I don't know. I didn't ask." Hailey shrugged. He looked important. Designer suit, expensive watch, glass office. But he was crying. Nia's expression shifted from amusement to intrigue. Tall, chiseled jaw, cold-looking eyes, but maybe the kind that hide something. "I mean, yeah, kind of," Hailey said hesitantly. Nia sat back slowly. "You may have just walked in on Richard Vale." "Richard Vale," Hailey repeated, the name unfamiliar. Nia blinked in disbelief. "You're kidding. You don't know who he is." "I only moved here a month ago," Hailey replied, a little defensive. Nia looked almost giddy. "Richard Vale is the founder and CEO of Vale Corp. Young, stupidly rich, total recluse. No one ever sees him. He rarely comes to meetings, and when he does, he's like this stone statue, zero emotion, zero warmth. People say he's haunted or something. Some tragic past." Hailey felt her stomach tighten. "You think it was really him?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Well, if he was crying, it couldn't have been a manager. Those guys barely feel shame, let alone emotions," Nia smirked. "And the only office with a full skyline view on the 15th floor is the CEO's." Hailey swallowed hard. For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the image. The man, the way his hand trembled, the sorrow carved into his expression. It didn't match the stories. That wasn't some cold-hearted mogul. That was a man drowning in grief. Elsewhere, on the top floor of Vale Corp., Richard Vale stared at the unopened pack of tissues resting beside his desk. His office was now empty, clean again, quiet, sterile. The storm outside had passed, but his heart still churned with the weight of memory. He hadn't cried in months. Not since the anniversary of that day. Not since he'd last visited the grave. But this morning had ambushed him. The photo was to blame. He had found it tucked into a drawer while searching for a lost file. A small, crumpled print of Mira sitting in the passenger seat of his old car, smiling despite the wind whipping her hair. It had been taken minutes before they fled town. His hand clenched at the thought. They had been so full of hope that night, so certain their love would carry them through. But the road was wet, and his hands were shaking, and the headlights came too fast. The pain never left. It simply dulled with time, buried beneath meetings, mergers, and cold efficiency. Until her. He didn't know her name, didn't know what department she belonged to. She had burst in like sunlight through a shuttered room, unafraid. She hadn't pitied him. She hadn't pretended not to see. She had seen him, the real him, and treated him like he was allowed to break. And then she had left. Richard turned to his computer, typed a few commands, and pulled up the internal employee directory. He keyed in the approximate time of the HR appointments. It wasn't hard to narrow it down. There, Hailey Martin. Intern. Hired today. His finger hovered over her profile for a long moment before he closed the window. He didn't know what it meant yet. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find out. Hailey sat at her desk the following week, heart pounding, fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard. A company-wide email had gone out earlier in the day. Mandatory, division-wide strategy presentation at 2 p.m. in the Executive Conference Hall. CEO Richard Vale will be delivering remarks. The room buzzed with a low-grade static of gossip and anxiety. Some of the older employees joked about dusting off their suits and remembering how to bow, while the interns, especially Nia, couldn't stop whispering about the mysterious CEO finally making an appearance. Hailey hadn't spoken of the incident since that morning. She had convinced herself she was mistaken. It couldn't have been Richard Vale. The man in the office had been too human, too raw. But now her stomach turned uneasily. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Yet something in her chest said otherwise. At exactly 1:58, the large glass doors to the executive conference hall opened. Hailey walked in with Nia and two other interns, doing her best not to wring her hands. The room was enormous. High ceilings, a massive projection screen, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Executives in sleek suits mingled quietly. The energy was taut and anticipatory. They took seats in the middle row. Nia nudged Hailey. "You think he's actually going to talk, or just glare and leave?" "I don't know," Hailey said softly. The lights dimmed. A marketing director made a brief introduction, thanking everyone for their attendance, and then with a subtle pause, delivered the name. "Please welcome our founder and CEO, Mr. Richard Vale." A hush fell. Every head turned toward the far door. He entered without ceremony, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, no tie. His presence was magnetic, still calm, but heavy with something unspoken. His jaw clean-shaven, movements precise. Hailey's breath caught in her throat. It was him. There was no mistaking the angular profile, the haunted eyes, the weight he carried like it was fused to his bones. He stepped up to the podium and surveyed the room. For a split second, his gaze swept over the audience and lingered. On her. Hailey felt her pulse spike. Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, pretending to fidget with her notepad. Nia raised an eyebrow, but Hailey didn't dare meet her eyes. Richard cleared his throat. His voice was deeper than she expected, smooth, deliberate, with a tired sort of elegance. "I don't speak at many of these," he began, "but I'm reminded now and then of why I built this company, what it was meant to stand for. I won't bore you with numbers or slides. I just want to talk about people." A quiet ripple passed through the room. Richard continued, his eyes flicking over faces, but always returning to one. "When we forget the people behind the systems, the late nights, the failures, we forget ourselves. Innovation and leadership don't come from perfection. They come from pain, from resilience, from starting over." His hand gripped the podium briefly. "I know that better than anyone." Hailey's chest tightened. He was talking about himself. The room was so still, she could hear the air conditioning hum. There was a pause, just long enough for it to register as intentional, before he shifted his tone, bringing the talk back to company values, innovation pipelines, and team structure. By the time the presentation ended, applause erupted. Executives nodded sagely, interns looked starstruck, and somewhere between the chaos of people standing and chairs scraping the floor, Hailey stood frozen. She needed to leave, get out, breathe, hide. But as she turned to slip away, a calm, composed voice cut through the crowd. "Hailey Martin?" She stopped. So did everyone within earshot. She turned slowly. Richard stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "I'd like a word," he said. Nia blinked. One of the supervisors nearly dropped his tablet. Hailey followed him wordlessly out of the hall. Her pulse thundered in her ears. They walked in silence until he opened the door to a private meeting room. Unlike his office, this space was smaller, less intimidating, warm-toned with bookshelves and a low table. He gestured for her to sit. She did, hands in her lap. He sat across from her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. "I'm sorry," Hailey said quickly. "About the other day, I didn't know where I was going, and I shouldn't have walked in. I thought, you were exactly where you needed to be," he interrupted gently. She blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't expect anyone to see me like that," he said. "Not here. Not ever." She swallowed, unsure what to say. He continued. "You said something that day. Something someone once told me when I needed to hear it. It's okay to cry." That wasn't the first time I'd heard those words. Hailey's eyes softened. She said it to you, didn't she? Richard nodded. She, he said quietly, was the only person who ever made me feel seen. And she died because I chose her over everything else. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Hailey's voice was gentle. I'm sorry. I don't know what made you stay in that room, Richard said. But you didn't look at me like I was weak. Or broken. You didn't treat me like the CEO. I didn't know you were, she admitted. He smiled faintly. Exactly. Silence fell again, but it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of recognition. Of two people on opposite sides of a wall neither had known was crumbling. I just wanted to thank you, Richard said finally. For seeing me. Hailey stood. You're welcome. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. You don't have to be anyone else with me, she said without looking back. If you ever want to talk again. Then she was gone. And for the second time in a week, Richard Vale found himself staring at a closed door, heart strangely full, wondering what had just walked into his life. The invitation came a few days later. It wasn't an email from HR or a company memo or a formal meeting request. It was a handwritten note, delivered in a crisp envelope by a silent assistant who gave Hailey no explanation, only a faint nod. It read, Lunch today. Rooftop garden. 1 p.m. RV. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it. Nia tried to peer over her shoulder, but Hailey tucked it away before she could. No way, Nia said, narrowing her eyes. Was that from? I don't know what you're talking about, Hailey muttered, already standing. Bathroom break. At 12:57, Hailey stepped out of the elevator and onto the rooftop terrace she didn't even know existed. Nestled between glass and steel, it was a surprising oasis, a private garden full of climbing ivy, stone pathways, and pale wooden benches. The hum of the city below was softened by the height, the skyline vast and open above. Richard was already there, seated at a small round table under a trellis covered in white jasmine. He stood as she approached. Hailey, he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from him. Thank you for coming. She sat, careful not to meet his eyes too directly. I almost didn't. I know, he said, but I hoped you would. A server appeared briefly, setting down 2 covered plates, then vanished again. She lifted the lid and blinked, her favorite, roasted tomato soup and grilled cheese with caramelized onions. Comfort food. How did you? She started. You mentioned it, Richard said, sipping from his glass. In your internship interview. You were talking about growing up with your grandmother. She raised her brows. You watched my interview? I watch all of them, he replied evenly. But I listened to yours. Her breath caught in her throat, just for a second. The meal passed slowly, gently. The conversation began stiff, whether work, minor anecdotes, but gradually loosened. She asked about the garden. He told her he commissioned it a few years after the accident, when everything in his life began to feel hollow. I needed a place where things still grew, he said quietly. When she asked about Mira, he didn't shy away. We met when I was 16, he said, voice low. She wasn't from my world. My parents hated her. They thought she was beneath me. She thought I was hiding behind my father's name. I think that's why I loved her. She made me want to be better. Hailey listened, not with pity, but with presence. We ran away the night before our engagement announcement. Not that anyone knew we were engaged. We were young and stupid and hopeful. His eyes clouded. It was raining. I was driving. He said nothing else for a long moment. Hailey didn't press. Eventually, he turned to her with a tired smile. You're easy to talk to. I'm not trying to fix you, she said. I think people don't need fixing. They just need space to be real. He looked at her for a long time. That's not something I get very often. After that day, it became a rhythm. Every Wednesday, she'd get a message, sometimes formal, sometimes scribbled on a post-it and left on her desk. Lunch? Rooftop. 1 o'clock. And each time she went. They talked about everything. Books. Music. What scared them. Her dreams of starting a nonprofit. His frustrations with the board. He told her about his childhood. Cold halls, strict rules, hollow dinners. She told him about growing up with her grandmother in a creaky little house filled with warmth and chipped teacups. Some days he was quiet, withdrawn, lost in his thoughts. On those days, she didn't push. She just sat beside him, eating quietly, giving him permission to exist without performance. Other days, he laughed, soft, hesitant at first, but real. The staff began to notice. Executives who once only saw Richard Vale as a sharp suit and curt nod now glimpsed something different. A slight smile when he passed Hailey in the hallway, a lightness in his step after lunch. She never acted differently around him. Never flaunted the time they spent. That's what made it safe for both of them. One afternoon, as they lingered after a meal, Richard turned to her suddenly. "I used to think grief was like a house you had to live in," he said. "The kind you don't get to leave. But lately, it feels more like a shadow. Still there. But I'm outside now. In the sun." Hailey looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "That's beautiful. It's because of you." The words sat between them, raw and unpolished. Hailey looked away, a flicker of something uncertain passing through her. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both understood that something was changing, quietly, inevitably, beneath the rhythm of their weekly conversations. And neither of them was quite ready to stop it. By early spring, the rumors were no longer whispers, they were winds. "Hailey Martin, yeah, the intern. She's close with the CEO. Lunch with Vale again today? Must be nice. I heard he asked her to his office 3 times this week alone." There was no malice in most of it, but there didn't need to be. Curiosity carried its own weight, especially when it came wrapped in envy. In the polished world of Vale Corp, attention was rarely a gift. Hailey noticed the shift. At first, it was subtle. A pause in conversation when she entered a room, a glance that lingered too long. Then came the sudden silence in elevators, the deliberate exclusion from small group meetings. She felt it like static in the air, unspoken accusations draped in polite smiles. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't ignore herself. The truth was, she had grown to crave their rooftop conversations. She found herself replaying them at night. Snippets of laughter, quiet glances, things left unsaid. Richard had stopped being the CEO in her mind. He was just Richard now. Complicated. Grieving. Kind in ways the world didn't see. And she was falling. Not in dramatic, sweeping fashion. It wasn't fireworks or music swelling in the background. It was quieter, deeper, like realizing you'd been walking beside someone in the dark and only just now turned on the light. But the world around them wasn't blind. And it wasn't kind. That Friday, after an unusually long board meeting, Richard called her into his office. Not the rooftop, not the lounge. His real office. The one with the skyline view and the heavy glass doors. He stood when she entered, but something about his posture was tight. Guarded. "Hailey," he said. "Sit, please." She did, perching on the edge of the leather chair. "There's something I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "My parents are unhappy." She blinked. "About me?" He hesitated. "About us." She felt her throat tighten. "There is no us," she said quietly. "Not like that. They think there is. They want there to be." Richard's jaw clenched. "They've been reaching out to board members. Asking questions. Wondering why I'm spending time with a junior-level intern, whether it's compromising objectivity, tarnishing the company's image." "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice faltered. He stood, pacing behind his desk. "They're the same people who threatened to cut me off when I chose Mira. They're subtle about it now, cleaner, but the pattern hasn't changed. Control dressed as concern." Hailey looked down at her hands. "Maybe I should step back. From the lunches, the meetings, everything. Just until things quiet down." He stopped pacing. "No," he said sharply. She looked up. "I won't let them do this again," he said, softer now. "I won't lose something real just because it makes other people uncomfortable." The word, real, hit something in her chest. "Hailey," he said, crossing the room. He stopped just short of touching her. "I know I've kept walls up. I know I'm not easy. But you make me feel like I can breathe again." And I'm not willing to pretend that doesn't matter. She stared at him, everything in her screaming both yes, and this is too much. Do you understand what they could do to me? She said, voice cracking. To us, even if we're only friends? I'm disposable in their world, Richard. You're not. He reached for her hand. His touch was warm, grounding. You're not disposable to me, he said. The words sat between them like a spark in dry grass. She stood, slowly withdrawing her hand. I need to think, she whispered. And then she walked out, heart racing, hands trembling, unsure if she was running away from something dangerous or towards something inevitable. That night, the storm broke. Not outside, but inside Richard Vale's home, a penthouse that felt more like a mausoleum. His parents, Michael and Corinne Vale, stood in his living room like they still owned the place. She's an intern, Richard, his mother said sharply. A nobody. She has no pedigree, no ties. What if she leaks information? What if she's after your money? Richard stood at the window, jaw tight, hands in his pockets. She's the first person in years who speaks to me like I'm not made of marble. His father scoffed. And that's a reason to gamble your name? Your company? No, Richard said, turning to face them. That's a reason to remember I have a soul. His mother's face darkened. She's not Mira. No, he said. She's not. And thank God. Because if you think I'm going to let you destroy another good thing in my life, then you've learned nothing. His father stepped forward. We built this company. No, I built it. You gave me money. I made it something worth protecting. Silence. Then quietly, leave. Corinne opened her mouth, but Michael pulled her back. We'll talk when you're thinking clearly. No, Richard said. We won't. And then they were gone. The next morning, Hailey arrived at her desk to find another envelope. This time it was different. It contained no time or place. Just a small card. You don't have to pull away. I'm not afraid anymore. R. She stared at it for a long time. Then she opened her phone and for the first time, texted him directly. I'm not afraid either. And she meant it. It was strange how the air in the office felt lighter, despite everything. Hailey noticed it first in the way Richard entered rooms now. Not as a shadow in a suit, but as a man who allowed himself to breathe. He smiled more often, not broadly, not carelessly, but in the subtle, unmistakable way of someone rediscovering warmth after years of cold. People talked, of course, but the edge was fading. The whispers still existed, but they softened, curiosity overtaking judgment. Richard, for all his distance and mystery, had always been a force in the company. But now he was present, and everyone felt it. After their silent exchange, her card, his message, her reply, something shifted. He didn't hide their friendship anymore. He didn't flaunt it either. He simply allowed it to be. Their lunches continued, though now they sometimes walked through the city instead of hiding on the rooftop. They grabbed coffee on quiet Sundays. He attended one of her nonprofit interest meetings in a local bookstore without telling anyone who he was. And they laughed, God, did they laugh. Not the polite kind, not the practiced smiles. Real, gut-deep, echoing laughter. Sometimes he looked at her mid-conversation and just shook his head in wonder, as if she were something he'd never expected to find in this life. I like this you, she said once as they sat on a park bench, eating sandwiches in the middle of a workday. He quirked an eyebrow. And what you was I before? The one hiding in shadows, she said. This one stands in the light. He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid the light would burn. Sometimes it warms, she said softly. And it did. The board didn't know what to make of the change. Richard began attending meetings again. He challenged old patterns, encouraged younger team members to speak up, and scrapped outdated policies that rewarded fear over innovation. He promoted Hailey, not to executive, not out of favoritism, but into a junior strategy position where she could contribute meaningfully. She had ideas, good ones, and he saw no reason to waste them on coffee runs and spreadsheet formatting. At first, some grumbled. But when one of her cost-saving initiatives saved the company 6 figures in a single quarter, the whispers turned into nods of respect. She's not just the intern, someone said at a board luncheon. No, Richard replied without looking up. She's the future. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and revisions, they found themselves alone in the elevator. The building had emptied. The silence between them was thick, but not heavy. Hailey leaned back against the mirrored wall, tired but content. Richard stood beside her, arms folded, watching the numbers descend slowly. "You know," she said, voice light, "this is starting to feel like a real friendship." He smiled. "Is that what this is?" She looked at him, suddenly serious. "Isn't it?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. I only know that when you're not in the room, I look for you. And when you are in the room, I'm already calmer." The elevator dinged. The doors opened. Neither of them moved. She took a step forward, but instead of walking out, she turned to face him fully. "I don't want to ruin anything," she whispered. "You won't," he said. "Unless you leave." Her eyes met his, and that was all it took. He kissed her. Not rushed. Not desperate. Just quiet and certain and full of everything they hadn't said aloud. When they parted, he rested his forehead gently against hers. "No shadows," he whispered. "No hiding," she agreed. After that, there was no pretending. They didn't need to tell the company. People already knew. But it wasn't scandalous. It was inevitable. Executives stopped questioning the relationship once it was clear that Hailey's position was earned. She never used Richard's name to get ahead, never sought favor, never demanded more than space to work and breathe. And Richard never gave her anything she didn't fight for herself. His parents remained silent. They didn't call. They didn't interfere. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. But for the first time in Richard's life, they didn't try to control his happiness. And that silence was its own kind of apology. It was late one night when Hailey found him alone in his office, lights low, city glowing outside the windows. He didn't hear her come in. He was looking at a photo, one she hadn't seen before. Mira, laughing, head thrown back, full of youth and freedom. Hailey stepped beside him. "She was beautiful," she said quietly. "She was," he nodded. "And for a long time, I thought I'd never feel anything close to that again." She looked up at him. "And now?" He turned to her, cupping her face gently. "Now I know love doesn't only happen once." And this time, when he kissed her, there was no hesitation. Only light. The sea air was different here. Not sharp like the wind that whipped around the city's glass towers. This was a soft, salt-laced breeze that rolled in like a whisper, lifting Hailey's hair as she stepped onto the wooden porch of the coastal cottage. The horizon was awash in fading gold, the sun dipping low over the waves, turning the whole world honey-colored. She turned slowly, taking in the scene, the whitewashed shutters, the gentle creak of the old boards under her feet, the rustling wildflowers around the edge of the property. It was exactly as he'd described it. Richard stepped up beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the water. He didn't say anything right away. "This place," he said finally, "was supposed to be for her. For Mira. I bought the land when we were still planning to run. Told her we'd grow old here." Hailey turned to him but didn't speak. She knew when to listen. "I never came back. Not until a few months ago. I thought it would feel like betrayal." "And now?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, really looked. There was no shadow in his face anymore. Just quiet peace, touched by memory, anchored by something stronger. "Now I know this place isn't a ghost," he said. "It's a beginning." He stepped past her and opened the door to the cottage. She followed him inside. It was simple. One floor, open layout. Wood-beamed ceilings. Large windows that looked out toward the ocean. Unfurnished, but warm. Clean. Waiting. Hailey trailed her fingers along the kitchen counter, the empty shelves, the windowsill lined with tiny sea-polished stones. "I want to build something here," Richard said from behind her. She turned. "With you." Her breath caught. She wasn't surprised. Not really. But it still hit her like the hush before a storm. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. Nothing extravagant. Dark wood, smooth finish. No grand gesture, no rehearsed speech. Just him, steady and sincere. "I used to think love meant protecting someone from your pain," he said. hiding the broken parts so you didn't burden them. But you walked in anyway. You handed me a tissue and told me it was okay to cry. And somehow, that one moment unraveled everything I thought I knew. He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, white gold, a soft, oval sapphire in the center, flanked by 2 tiny diamonds. Understated. Beautiful. I don't need perfect, he said. I just need real. I need you. Not just on rooftops or late-night calls. I want you beside me in this house. In this life. Will you marry me? Hailey stared at the ring for a long second. Then she looked up, eyes shining, lips trembling with a smile. Yes, she said. There was no scream. No dramatic leap. Just a quiet certainty as she stepped into his arms, kissed him, and felt the past dissolve like mist in the morning light. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony overlooking the water. No press. No board members. Just a handful of people who mattered. Nia beaming from the front row, Richard's assistant fighting tears, a few of Hailey's childhood friends, and surprisingly, his parents. Corinne Vale had aged since Hailey had last seen her. Her usual frostiness melted just enough when she hugged Hailey and whispered, "He smiles more now." Thank you. Richard had been shocked when they RSVP'd at all. Even more when they sat in the back, hands folded, quiet, not meddling. Maybe it was growth. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was this. Richard Vale no longer lived behind glass. He was no longer the broken man in the office at dawn, weeping in silence. And Hailey, no longer the unsure intern with damp shoes and a paper folder, was now the woman he called home. Years later, when asked how they met, Richard always smiled before answering. She walked into the wrong office. Hailey would roll her eyes. He was crying. And she stayed. That's how the story always began. Not in grand entrances or sweeping romance, but in one small moment of kindness that turned out to be the right door all along. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.